Hello, this is History in Practice. This is Catherine Pickering Antonova, professor of history at Queens College at City University of New York. This is just a quick video commenting on one I watched about the Danny Masterson trial. I'll link the video I was watching in the description. I follow a few of these kind of ex-Scientologists. I find the whole Scientology thing fascinating. So one of them, they've been following the Danny Masterson trial very closely, and so I've kind of peripherally been hearing about it. And this particular ex-Scientologist who hosts a show had Tony Ortega, who is the reporter who reported on the trial daily. They got a big coup of an interview with the foreman of the jury. So it's a really interesting look inside what the jury was thinking, because this is the hung jury. So there's now a decision being made about whether to have a new trial. And it came out that the decision, there were three Jane Does who charged Danny Masterson with rape, accused Danny Masterson of rape or sexual assault, and the jury had decided there were more people for each charge on the not guilty side, but they couldn't come to a conclusion. So the foreman was explaining, and it's a really interesting video. And one of the things that came out really clearly is that this jury, I think like most juries, most likely, took the job incredibly seriously, understood their responsibility to the victims, to Danny Masterson, whose life was on the line, and to the public, to society. They understood that very well. They understood the rules very well. They followed the rules. They did their absolute best. And I think that is often the case. I've never been lucky enough to be on a jury. I always get knocked right off. But I've been in enough of the process to see how you get you're stuck waiting in rooms for a really long time, and then all these officials are telling you very official things, and you get kind of into a mindset of, okay, this is a big deal, and you have absolutely nothing else to do. So it's not like your energy is divided in following the rules, right? So I really believe that's the case with a lot of juries, with the vast majority. And the foreman made it really clear in response to a variety of questions that he was asked that the jury kind of understood the situation in the following way: that these accusations were made by the women against Danny Masterson with basically virtually no outside evidence. So it's a he said, she said. The accusations were made, for the most part, much later. They didn't take that into account, which was quite correct. It's understood why there are reasons that doesn't happen. In this case, particularly the Church of Scientology didn't allow them to make accusations at the moment, even though they wanted to. One actually did anyway. So they rightly didn't disregarded that, and they just took it as a credibility case. That who is more credible, and then they went through item by item and made their absolute best judgment in the fairest way they felt they could do. That is the ideal jury. The jury system is set up so that in a case like this, and of course a lot of cases come down to basically a credibility question, that's the idea of a jury of your peers, as 7 or 12 or however many people are going to sort of go with their gut of who's the most readable, as like, these are a bunch of humans. We have to make a decision. Decision has to be made. And there's no other way to make it than by a sort of gut credibility check. That's what a jury is for. And the safety in it is having it be kind of random people, so that you hope that, direct corruption and bias is weeded out of the process, and that it's enough people that whatever sort of idiosyncrasies there are, right, would get kind of worked out in the wash of the numbers. And then if you need a unanimous vote, it should be that way, because it should be unanimous to, put someone, in this case, I think Danny Masterson was facing, I think it was 45 years in jail, so, really big consequences, that should be something that's kind of overwhelming to the gut of the public. Based on their, first person seeing all the testimony. That is a good system. And here's where I see it totally failing in this case, in my opinion. That's my opinion on it. I think it failed, despite the absolute best efforts of everyone involved. And I think it failed because I think it nails the sort of crux of the problem in American culture. That is why we can't have nice things in all kinds of ways, that it's just sort of screwing up everything, because it means that the average American's gut kind of take on things is fundamentally wrong. Which is not to say that we're all idiots. No, absolutely not. It's not to say that gut instinct isn't actually a pretty good, especially when there's nothing else to go on. It's not a bad way to go, right? Particularly in a case like this, where you have the gut instincts of a bunch of people having to be unanimous. That's actually a pretty good setup, in situations where there is no, there is no proof that exactly shows the way to go. We're living in a world of uncertainty, right? But here's the fundamental flaw that I see, the kind of crux of the issue that I think is crystallized in this jury, which we happen to be able to know quite a bit how they were thinking thanks to this foreman explaining it. They dismissed expert testimony, and I gather there was just one expert. There were others on the list who didn't get called or whatever. The one expert was basing what she was explaining on a research study. And in cross-examination, the typical sort of lawyer skills brought out any possible flaws in the study, that it was based on college students who were paid for the study, which, because of lack of funding, of better funding, that's how a lot of research is done. And the jury decided to dismiss it based on the fact, and this is kind of something we all know based on watching a lot of TV, but I think also, based on watching some real jury trials lately, is something that is very true, that you can get an expert to say anything, that for every expert saying this, there's an expert saying that. And so they just decided any experts are irrelevant. I think that was probably, I guess, what the jury did in the Depp Heard trial as well. And I think they also just went with credibility on that. In that case, I think the outcome was correct based on evidence, the way I would analyze the evidence. But I think either way, the jury system is basically working the same way. And again, it's a good setup, but I think it's ultimately flawed, whether the outcome is actually, if we were God and could see the reality, if we could judge it that way, I bet we would see it sometimes right and sometimes wrong. You hope it's right more than it's wrong, right? And that's kind of all we can do. But to get back to, I think there's something correctable in this that would fix a lot of things in our society. And it's all about the appeal to authority fallacy. The appeal to authority fallacy, that's its kind of official name, is the fallacy that because someone who seems to have credentials said something, you believe them. You shouldn't believe anyone ever based on their credentials. And I say that as someone with credentials, right? Yet we do this all the time. We want to support our own views by referring to the credentials of someone else. There's endless battles on social media about who has credentials, who doesn't. The thing is, the way those always go is someone's like, well, who the hell are you? And then that person presents credentials, and then they attack the credentials. And they say, well, why do you even have credentials? You're just bragging. And that's always where it ends, right? So it always goes in this circle that ends nowhere. The thing about the appeal to the authority fallacy, the definition of the fallacy is that you can't actually believe someone just because of their credentials. You can't stop there. That's the first part of the basic definition of the fallacy. You got to follow the reasoning out. And this is the answer to everything, right? If you follow the reasoning out, the idea is you can't believe someone just because of their credentials. What you do is the credentialed person should be able to explain the evidence and reasoning that allows them to draw the conclusion that they drew. You don't believe it because they said it or because of their credentials. What you do is you follow the evidence and reasoning that person should be able to present. From this, we can draw some conclusions. If a person with credentials cannot or does not provide the evidence and reasoning, don't believe them. It's not enough to go on. When they do provide the evidence and reasoning, obviously the rest of us are not as equipped to judge that evidence and reasoning as the credentialed person is. Plus, of course, that credentialed person could always be biased or lying or something and misrepresenting evidence and reasoning. So the best way to come to a conclusion is to have multiple credentialed people or experts to present evidence and reasoning. And what you do is you judge the evidence and reasoning. You don't just say, oh, there's multiple and they disagree, so they cancel each other out. I get that gut instinct, but it's a false gut instinct. You're just throwing it out when it was there was valuable information to be had there. And that's exactly what we need in a case of he said, she said, or credibility. What we need is evidence and reasoning that is objective, that is outside of the situation, in order to help us not make the judgment, but to check our guts. Because the thing about our guts, on the one hand, humans are remarkably good at perceiving, body language, unspoken clues, how we interact with each other socially. Most of us have enough basic emotional intelligence to get a feeling. This is how we live in the world, is that we get a sense from people about whether they're trustworthy, whether they're telling us the truth. The thing is, it's really far from 100%. I'd say maybe slightly better than 50% for most of us. And some of us are worse at it than that. Some of us are a little bit better at it than that. So you hope in a jury of 12, say, that it kind of washes out. That's still kind of just over 50% maybe, of those social skills kind of helping us to figure that out. Ideally, with so much at stake, right, you're going to want to add to that anything you can. And of course, if there was direct evidence in this case, that's what we want. That's what's preferable. In a case like this where there isn't, effectively sort of solid, there was a couple of photographs, but like, you know, even that was sort of debatable. So there was not really like clear, objective, empirical evidence to go on. There wasn't even circumstantial evidence. So it's basically just a credibility issue. In that case, the other thing you can have, which can check your gut, not replace your gut instinct, but check it, and check it specifically in a way that accounts for exactly the ways we know our guts can go wrong, which is unconscious prejudice. That's one of the big ones: racism, sexism, classism. We all live in a society that is structured around those things. And whatever position we take on them, it forms our perceptions of other people. And we are not aware of it happening when it happens. It happens in our lizard brains. And with analysis later, you might be able to figure it out. But for the most part, we all have it. We can't feel it at the time. So you could just sort of auto-correct. And that's often the best we can do. And I strongly recommend doing it. Just be as self-aware as you can of your own biases and auto-correct for it. But in something like this, something as important as, say, a case where someone's life is at stake, where victims getting justice is at stake, what we can do is introduce some expert evidence that can correct not only for our kind of biases, but also for the other problem with our gut instinct, which is that the way our gut instinct tends to work is, I put myself in this person's shoes, what would I do? Well, we're not all the same. And so if you expect someone else to react to a situation based on how you would react, you're going to be wrong more often than not. If you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes and you're also not correcting for the context in which that person was living. For example, I'm thinking, well, if I'm telling a story to someone, I'm going to obviously include the big details. And so if someone didn't do that and then they explain those big details later, the only explanation I can come up with is that they were lying. And that was what the majority of this jury decided. Here's the thing, though. If the story being told the first time was being told in a moment of extreme trauma, that is different from me saying right now, I'm literally sitting in an armchair going, well, this is what I would do in that situation. Trauma affects our brains in really extreme ways. We have hard science on this, hard empirical data from fMRIs and a million other things, that trauma basically derails your brain from functioning. So that when someone tells a story in the middle of trauma, they are going to be, for the protection of themselves, deliberately hiding from their own selves some of the biggest things. That is classic trauma response. And I think that's exactly what we saw with these victims. And apparently there was even an expert on the stand who tried to explain that, but because under cross-examination, they sort of wheedled through the details of the study. It's not just that one study. And this is where expertise matters. And I think maybe I wasn't there, I didn't see it, and I didn't even listen to the reporting afterwards. But what ideally I would like to see is that an expert would be capable of explaining, okay, this is the very natural gut instinct to expect how a story would be told. In this case, what we have to account for is that the story is being told in the middle of a trauma. How does trauma affect our bodies and brains? Here's what we know about how trauma affects our bodies and brains, not just from one study, but from hundreds of studies. And here's an example of how that works. And now here's the specific study I really want to go into in detail because it's the closest to the particular situation we have here. That kind of what they call foundation in a legal system, of providing the foundation of what context in which we should understand this particular study. Why are we talking more about this study than all the other studies? The fact that there are all these other studies, maybe that was not how it was presented. If it was, regardless, the jury just decided it was a kind of, we've been kind of trained to say experts are a bunch of biased eggheads. They are parasites on society. They will say anything for money, yet they're all paid too much. I mean, it's self-contradictory cliches about expertise that are fundamentally come from an anti-intellectual culture. And I mean, Richard Hofstadter, the historian at Columbia, wrote about this many decades ago, going back to the 50s and 60s, that it goes back to pioneer days and all the rest. We live in an anti-intellectual culture. If you don't understand what that means or don't you can look it up, you can read about it. There are lots and lots of books written about it, but you can also just go to a different kind of culture, and there's a ginormous difference. We live in an anti-intellectual culture, and part of the way that manifests, particularly since social media and all these kind of credential wars on the internet, right, is that most people have kind of decided that expertise is nothing but credentials. So they're only looking at the credentials. That's the appeal to authority fallacy, when in fact you should never be looking at the credentials. I mean, if you have nothing else to go on, you might be left with that, and it's better than zero information. But credentials are basically garbage information. What you need is the evidence and reasoning. And you should look to get that from someone who is reliable in actually having access to the evidence and reasoning, and someone who can explain it well. And that would be someone with a lot of training and experience in it. And, whether that's, the Marissa Tomei character in My Cousin Vinny, who knows cars, right? The reason in that movie we knew as an audience and as the jury in the fictional trial could believe her is not because she said she knew cars. Who would believe this, youngish woman with a New York accent that she's an expert on cars? She showed her expertise with the information that came out of her mouth. It was clear she knew 1,000 times more than anyone else in the room and the vast majority of humanity about cars because of what she was able to explain. So what you want with experts or credentials, if they're not providing evidence and reasoning, ask for the evidence and reasoning. Now, mind you, on social media, you can go into sea lioning where you're just making everybody do all your work for you. You can also read books, Google, look for things yourself because it's all out there. Experts write books. And so, not every expert should be responsible to be producing everything they know from a lifetime of study and experience in any moment because some rando asks them, right? That's not fair. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying if there's, a situation like this, a legal case or any sort of major question you're trying to decide in your own life, yes, go find out who the experts are. Always look for more than one, as many as you can. Look for differing opinions. It's a good thing to have experts on both sides, not because they cancel each other out. And yes, you should consider, particularly in a court case, and I think it's a flaw in our system that experts are paid by either side. I think the experts should be paid by the court system, but that's taxpayer money, so that's a whole other issue. But ideal, if they're paid by differing sides, you need to take into account who's paying them. That is important. That's part of the evidence and reasoning you should be considering. But also, they do know more than Joe Schmo. They know more than you on the subject if it's a case where you're not an expert, right? So what you want is to get different experts, as different as possible, and ask about the evidence and reasoning. Compare their evidence and reasoning. And in this case, you're not just comparing them on a kind of gut level of, oh, he feels trustworthy, she doesn't, or vice versa, or whatever. What ideally we should be able to do as humans, and unfortunately I think we fail at this really, really badly through lack of practice in public life in America all the time, because we tend to ignore the evidence and reasoning. I mean, every cable show under the sun, when they offer experts, they don't present the evidence and reasoning. It's a pure credential battle for the clicks because it's a personality war. It pushes people's buttons because people already have a side going in, and you just get into the fight over sides. There's no substance to it whatsoever, which is why I haven't voluntarily watched cable news in 20 years, because it's garbage, just 1,000%, nothing but garbage that is put there to rile you up, to push your emotional buttons, so you'll keep watching, so they get the money. And that's the only reason it exists. The only point in having experts testify or explain anything, consult on anything, is to get the evidence and the reasoning, not just to have that name and that set of credentials brought in. That's an appeal to authority fallacy. It has no value in itself. What an expert can do is present evidence and reasoning, and then you are supposed to evaluate the evidence and reasoning on rational terms, not credibility terms, not personality terms, but rational terms. One person explains the evidence and then reasons through it to a conclusion in this way. Another person with similar expertise explains the evidence and reasons through it to a certain conclusion. Their conclusions conflict. What do you do then? Well, first look at the evidence. Are they presenting the same evidence? Do they basically agree on the evidence? In some cases, the evidence is basically the same. They both accept the same evidence. They're drawing different conclusions. Then we come to reasoning. I'll get back to that. What if their evidence is different? Well, then you have to ask, where's the evidence coming from? and who's got the better evidence, basically? Or is it that they've both got good evidence, but they're both have partial evidence? So either of their conclusions are based on partial evidence. What we need to do is go back to just hold that all that evidence together, because all of the evidence seems to be reliable. We're going to have to try to reason through it ourselves, keeping in mind the principles of how to reason through evidence that have been explained to us from both sides. And consider that. That is a much higher intellectual task. It requires a lot more energy and effort and good communication. That's asking more for a jury to do than to go on their gut instincts, and even more than what they do in he said she said case, which is to sort of look for contradictions very meticulously. That's good, but it is not going to lead you to a correct answer every time, because contradiction is a part of how human beings operate. We are contradictory. We're contradictory in how we behave. We're contradictory in how we think. We're contradictory in how we present ourselves in front of different people. We're contradictory in the way we articulate things. We don't always articulate things well. We don't always remember things well, and our memories are really bad. So if all you do is rationally look for contradictions and judge credibility on that, you're going to get the wrong answer. If all you do is a sort of gut check of I like this person or I like that person, you're just going to reflect your own biases, also not get the right answer. So how do you get out of those difficulties? You should take into consideration the gut reactions and the contradictions in the evidence, but you also need outside evidence and reasoning to help you walk through where biases might be coming in, where when you're trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can take an extra step and say, well, if I was experiencing trauma, and let's say I've never experienced that kind of trauma myself, so I don't know how I would react, I can take the evidence from collectively lots of experts over lots of years that is maybe summarized for me by one expert, but lots of experts over lots of years actually interviewing people in those situations. How do they react? And then that's a valuable thing I can take into account. That should not be auto rejected because an evidence is paid for by one side in our court system. Instead, take the evidence as it is and consider that as a real thing because it came from someone with credentials. And ideally, best situation is to have multiple people with credentials, especially if they disagree. Okay, so let's go back to the interpretation thing. Let's say both experts on opposite sides of an issue have exactly the same evidence. They agree that the evidence is basically the evidence is presented. There's no disagreements about that. They each drew different conclusions. What we tend to do is look for a quick and easy way to say, well, that person came to that conclusion because they're paid for by that side. That person came to that conclusion, they're paid for by that side. It's very easy to do that, and our minds are going to go to what's easy. We're also conditioned culturally to see it that way and to sort of see bias everywhere. I see this so much in my students. One of the things we teach when you're interpreting empirical evidence in a historical way, our empirical evidence are largely documents from the past, right? Primary sources. My students are trained they're actually very good at identifying bias. They know what bias is. They usually misuse the adjective and noun forms, but they basically know the concept. They find bias very easily. Where they go wrong is they think when you find bias, you disappear it. It should be taken out of consideration. That's not how it works. If we're trying to understand a document from the past, these documents were produced by humans. Every single one of them is filled with bias, as is anything else humans do. If we want to understand it, we want to understand the nature of the bias, where it comes from, what effect it has, and what effect that would then have on the intended audience at the time. The bias is the evidence. It's what gives us information. It's the last thing to throw out. It's where you zero in and pay attention. Don't throw it out. And I have this problem endlessly with my students, right? So in this court case thing where we're seeing one, expert come to a certain conclusion, another expert comes to another conclusion. And yes, usually the experts tend to come to the conclusion for the side they're paying for. Well, that's because the lawyers select an expert for the side that they want, right? And again, I think ideally it should be paid for by the public, but I'm also a taxpayer. So, I get the problems with that. We have to, for now, work with the system that we have. Here's the thing. Because each side is selecting an expert who they hope will get them the result that they want, and I suspect, I'm not in the system, so I don't know for sure, but I suspect if they get an expert who doesn't produce the outcome that they want, if they have time, they'll probably go out and find another one, right? And that's probably why they're consulting multiple experts. So yes, you can expect each side in a court case to produce an expert for their side. don't just dismiss it as all expertise is without value. That's the dumb American way to do things. What you do instead is look at how they handle evidence. Okay, now we're getting to the point where let's say they agree on the evidence. So now we get to their interpretations. How do we evaluate that? That is the tricky part. First, consider the fact that just because they each came to opposite conclusions, each conclusion fits with the side that paid them, that doesn't mean they're both wrong. It doesn't mean that they're both without value. Most likely, if it is a two-sided thing, the answer, it's a yes or no question, right? Then one of them is right. Logically, one of them has to be right, even though they're both have the equal incentive to be biased. Both have every reason to assume is probably biased. Nonetheless, if it's a yes or no question, one of them is actually correct. And it's your job to figure out which is correct, not to just dump that whole set of evidence, because there's still evidence there that can help you make a decision in something very high stakes. And that's, I think, what's happened in the Stanley Masterson case based on the foreman. There was good, useful evidence that could have helped them make a stronger than random conclusion based on credibility. They dismissed that evidence because it came from experts, and they see experts as biased, which is correct, but they just threw it out because it was biased instead of evaluating it through the lens of knowing it's biased. And that's what you actually have to do. So again, going back to the scenario, evidence is all agreed on. They come to different conclusions. One side is probably correct, or at least mostly correct, right? And one side is wrong, but there's no way to figure out which might be biased because they both have equal incentives to be biased. That's where you have to look at their reasoning step by step and evaluate their reasoning, evaluate how they think about evidence. So say there's a piece of evidence and you identify the pieces of evidence they think about differently. The evidence that is valid and relevant, they agree on, but they disagree on, say, how to look at this particular piece of evidence. Let's say, I don't know, the O.J. Simpson glove or whatever. I don't even remember enough details of that case to be used it as an example, but if the glove fits, there's two ways of looking at that, right? Either the glove fits, so you must acquit, or whatever it was. I don't even remember the phrase. But if the two experts are looking at that evidence differently, ask which to you is the fairer way to look at that evidence. That's valid, but also ask why is each expert explaining why they looked at that evidence that way. Some will say in 99 of 1,000 cases, according to research where we actually tested that, this is the conclusion we should draw. And the other expert is saying, obviously you have to draw this conclusion. That's not reasoning. They didn't give you any reasoning. They just said obviously. What they did is fall back on their credentials and their authority as having credentials. They didn't give you reasoning. In that case, I would go with the person who explained their reasoning. It's not 100%. That could end up wrong, but it's less likely statistically to end up wrong than going with the guy who just said obviously or dismissing all the expert evidence altogether. Those are less reliable ways to go in a case of uncertainty. We're very bad at handling uncertainty. And court cases often are, a decision is made in a climate of uncertainty. If the evidence doesn't just make it obvious what happened, then you are making a consequential decision in which no human will ever 1,000% know, other than the victim and the accused, who are we can't rely on. So you have to make a decision in a climate of uncertainty, and your best decision is not solely a gut decision. That is going to be just a product of your personality and your social circumstances and your history and all of those things. It actually has nothing to do with the accused and the victim. It has everything to do with you. So that's not a good way to go. You also can't just pick a side based on what an expert told you because the expert said that. That's an appeal to authority fallacy. The way out, what I'm saying, is to look at the evidence, judge the evidence. Once the evidence is kind of established, if it is, then you go to how each expert handles the evidence. And in some cases, what you might find, a worst case kind of scenario for making a consequential decision like this, is what expert A gives you really good reasoning about how they handled some evidence. Expert B gives really good reasoning about how they handled other piece of evidence. And if you kind of flip it, expert A also kind of just said, well, yeah, obviously, or didn't really explain about another piece in which the other expert was really good, and vice versa, right? So in other words, your kind of take on each expert is pretty mixed, and there's not a good reason to kind of go with one or the other. One of the things that you should consider at that point is the answer in between. Is it either literally unknowable, in which case we fall in the presumption of innocence, generally in our justice system, it's, just no one can know with any degree of like even 1% over 50, right? Or is there actually an answer that is somewhere in between, that one expert is partially correct, the other expert is partially correct, and the sort of reality, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. If it's not a strict yes or no flip, right, there it could be somewhere in there, and then you're going to have to reason from that accordingly. And obviously that's going to be entirely dependent on the facts in front of you and the context in front of you, the situation in front of you. And that's where a jury needs to walk through those things. But what they absolutely should not do is simply throw out all expert testimony as biased. Never throw out anything as soon as you see bias. What you do is look more closely at the bias. Where is the bias coming from? What does it lead to? What can it tell me? That journey down that path may lead you to say, wow, this person's just hopelessly talking about something that is based all about themselves and has nothing to do with the case, and throw them out. You may land there eventually, but you should never just jump there first case. What you need to do instead is look at the evidence and the reasoning. If someone who claims to have expertise does not, in a case like this where it is their responsibility to produce evidence and reasoning, if they don't, I do dismiss at that point. Because if you have any claim to expertise, you should be able to produce evidence and reasoning. If, for example, you've been invited to a talk show to discuss an important question, or you're a paid expert on a court case, not somebody on Twitter, being confronted by a stranger. Obviously, that they have no responsibility in that case to do anything for that person. But in a case where they should be expected to actually weigh in as an expert, and their time is being compensated and so on, you should expect to see evidence and reasoning presented. If it's not, that's someone who's not offering anything of value. They're both offering expertise that is grounded in evidence and reasoning. If there's more than two, which is even better, right? The more points of view, the better you get. You are responsible to dive into that evidence and reasoning, not because you have an equal ability to sort through it, but if there's a question of uncertainty, all you can do, if you're forced to make a decision, is weigh how the experts have reasoned through it. And that we're not great at, but we're better at that than going with our guts. So in the case of uncertainty, that's what we should do. Okay, thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.